We kick off business news at this hour, focusing on a long-standing debate around the value of the rand. This as the strength in the local currency is said to be rattling some cages, and as a result, we bring you a conversation around how the current climate is reacting to rand movements. We are joined virtually by Senior Investment Analyst at Morningstar Investment Management SA, Michael Kruger. Michael, thank you so much for your time. I think let's first, get into what it is that makes up the value of the rand. As I indicated earlier, it's a long-standing debate about whether it's overvalued or what status of the local currency should we be looking at, and from what perspective.
Morning, Tumisang. Thanks so much for having me on the show. So there are obviously quite a few different ways that you can calculate the fair value of the rand. So one of the most well-known ones is obviously absolute purchasing power parity. The most popular of those is probably the Big Mac index, where they compare the price of Big Macs around the globe and work out fair exchange rates from that particular level. I think at Morningstar, the way that we look at it is to use relative purchasing power parity, and that basically looks at inflation differentials between different countries. So there are three different metrics we look at. We look at consumer price inflation, producer price inflation, and PPP, and try to work out a fair value based on those differences between different markets.
Speaking of fair value, globally, would you say that there is a trusted way in which the rand can be valued in relation to its emerging market peers? And again, I go back to the initial stance of how do we then determine the status of the rand in value proposition?
So at Morningstar, our fair value for the rand is currently just over 14 against the US dollar. So currently with the rand trading at between 16.30 and 16.40 against the US dollar, we regard the currency as on the cheap side of fair value. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the rand often doesn't trade singly at that fair value level. It can breach those particular levels quite frequently. So often it can trade on the cheap side of fair value quite significantly. Sometimes if we have a sort of massive commodity upswing or emerging markets are in vogue at a particular point in time, the currency can actually breach that on the low side as well. So that's just important to keep in mind too.
That said, Michael, how do we then look at the local currency performance when it comes to other currencies? We often see the US dollar having effects on the performance of the rand depending on how strong or how weak it is. And unfortunately, the rand, if one looks back from today to about 10 years ago, we've sort of normalized levels of 14 to the US dollar as seemingly strong. So how do we weigh the two options, especially when one is looking at valuation from the side of what it is they can trade into?
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind that in South Africa, because we generally have a high inflation environment and a high interest rate environment compared to most developed markets, you would expect to see that sort of depreciating trend in the currency over time. And that's based on pure economics. So if you look back in the day, the rand was trading at about sort of 6 to the dollar. Obviously, over time, it's depreciated quite significantly, currently sitting at that level of just over 16. But given inflation differentials between us and the US and other key developed markets in particular, you would expect that depreciating trend over time. I think it's just important also to keep in mind that the US dollar has been very, very strong against the majority of currencies so far this year. So in the first two quarters, in Q1 and Q2, we obviously had the Russia-Ukraine war. We had interest rate hiking cycles in some of the key central developed markets. And therefore, emerging markets in South Africa in particular were under pressure a little bit because of that. And that's because of perceived sort of risky assets or emerging markets in particular coming under pressure during that particular time.
Currently, what is the advantageous position of the rand in terms of definition? Because in the notes that you have provided, you indicate that there's a level of confidence and improved sentiment as well as value around how the local currency is seen due to recent trade.
Yeah, I think it's just important to keep in mind that obviously as South Africans, we're quite patriotic and we're quite inwardly focused and focused on what's happening around us. So obviously in South Africa at the moment, we have a lot of negativity. There's political infighting, electricity shortages, subdued growth in the South African environment. But it's important to keep in mind that the rand is largely dominated by global factors. So the depreciation we've seen in the first half of the year has mainly been due to those global movements as opposed to something South African specific that we're doing incorrectly. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. That the rand is one of the most liquidly traded emerging market currencies globally. If you do see that risk-off environment, you will see depreciation in the rand. And a lot of the time, it's not South African specific stuff that we're doing incorrectly. It's actually global factors.
But it is also important to look at the risks that emerge from the domestic challenges that you've noted, the likes of load shedding, as well as some sort of uncertainty when it comes to policy reform in the country. How does that play a part in how the rand is viewed globally?
Absolutely. So just referencing a working paper that the IMF provided in 2016, looking at what actually drives the volatility of the exchange rates. When they looked at domestic factors in particular, it wasn't actually economic movements or economic surprises that drove the currency. It was more political uncertainty. And I think the most extreme example of that was obviously Nene-gate in December 2015, when we had 3 finance ministers in the space of a weekend. And we saw significant appreciation in the currency over that period. So uncertainty is something that markets generally don't like, and investment markets can react quite significantly if there is that uncertainty during a particular period.
At this stage of the year, we can safely say that the rand has been resilient, and one question that we often get is whether this is a good time for one to take their money offshore. Your views there?
Yeah, so we get those questions from clients quite often as well, and it's quite funny because it usually happens at the worst point in time when the currency is blown out significantly. I think it's important as investors just to keep in mind that you need to have a holistic financial plan. So talk to your financial advisor. Obviously, offshore exposure is a key component for South Africans in particular. We do have that home bias in our investment portfolios, given the fact that we're only allowed to take a certain amount of offshore exposure in our retirement products in particular. But I would say that you shouldn't be timing the currency. I would rather say timing the market is superior to timing the market. And therefore, I wouldn't say there's a particular time that it's better now to take offshore exposure or not take offshore exposure. I would say a significant amount of offshore exposure is important, but try not to time these things because you 100% never going to get it right.
Thank you so much. Michael Kruger, analyst at Morningstar Investments, talking to us about the value of the rand.